President Trump hails, and I quote, tremendous progress in the push to persuade North Korea to denuclearize. He says that a second summit between him and Kim Jong-un is on the cards. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Washington is pulling out of an arms control treaty with Russia, which dates back to the Cold War. We'll ask our White House correspondent what that means in just a moment. And a trade deal between the EU and Japan takes effect, meaning that tariffs are lifted on the bulk of imports from both sides. That deal could mean a big GDP boost for Japan. Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom in Paris. I'm Tom Burgess-Wilson. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We're going to begin with the latest US diplomatic efforts to persuade North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. Well, in this regard, President Donald Trump has hailed what he called tremendous progress and said that the date and location for a second summit between him and Kim Jong-un will be announced next week. Well, the US Special Envoy for North Korea, meanwhile, says that Washington has a long list of demands, but the US could make some concessions to the secretive communist nation. And that's something he's going to be discussing when he arrives on the Korean peninsula this weekend. France 24's Ivana Scatola tells us more.
Last June marked the first time a sitting US president met with a North Korean leader, signing an optimistic but vague declaration of their commitment to denuclearization. Although it was a landmark meeting, little progress has been made since. Now, as they gear up for a second summit, both sides are ready to make some concrete demands.
From our side, we are prepared to discuss many actions that could help build trust between our two countries and advance further progress. In parallel, on the Singapore summit objectives of transforming relations, establishing a permanent peace regime on the peninsula, and complete denuclearization.
In his speech, he also revealed that North Korea had in October pledged to destroy all its nuclear enrichment facilities. But Washington wants clear-cut commitment. It set an extensive list of demands. It wants North Korea to allow expert access and monitoring mechanisms of its nuclear and missile sites, ensure removal or destruction of stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, and provide a complete list of its nuclear assets. Pyongyang, though, has complained that the US has done little to reciprocate for its actions to dismantle some weapon facilities and freeze weapons testing. It's repeatedly demanded the lifting of US-led sanctions and diplomatic recognition, and a formal end to the 1950s Korean War. Despite optimism from the White House about the talks, US Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats has said North Korea is unlikely to ever denuclearize completely. The date and location of the next summit is expected to be announced in President Trump's State of the Union address on Tuesday.
Now, today marks the beginning of a trade deal between the European Union and Japan. The deal sees tariffs on more than 90% of imports from both sides lifted, and we'll see the rules relaxed on just how the two countries trade with each other. Well, the Economic Partnership Agreement is the result of a deal struck last December, and the Japanese government believes it will give the country's GDP boost a boost to the tune of 1% and create roughly 290,000 jobs. Well, together, Japan and the EU account for 37% of the value of the world's trade. Well, that free trade deal coincides with talks between China and the United States on the subject of tariffs. France 24's Michael Penn in Tokyo has more now on this interesting contrast.
As we all know, when the Trump administration came in I guess 2017, beginning 2017, they brought a spirit of protectionism, the idea that tariffs and these sorts of things were what they believed to be in the interests of the U.S. But outside of the U.S., there's really no one who agreed with that perspective, certainly not the EU governance or in Japan as well. As close as Japan is an ally, the Abe administration does not agree with the U.S. on its trade stance in this respect. So for both parties, for the Japanese and the European Union, they feel quite good about this agreement because they feel it shows their commitment to global trade at a time in which it's under assault from the American administration and some others.
France 24's Michael Penn reporting from Tokyo. Now, prosecutors at the International Criminal Court have said today that the former Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo can be released, provided that he's not allowed to return to Ivory Coast. Well, last month, the former strongman was cleared of charges of crimes against humanity committed 8 years ago during the post-election violence in the West African nation. Well, the Hague Tribunal will now have to decide whether the 73-year-old should be kept behind bars pending the appeal process against his acquittal. Well, France 24's Ellen Gainsford takes a closer look now at this legal process.
When Laurent Gbagbo's trial began on January 28, 2016, it was the first time the International Criminal Court had tried a former head of state. 5 years earlier, Gbagbo was still the Ivorian president, running for re-election. The campaign had been tense. So was election day on 28 November 2010. The tension escalated further when the Electoral Commission declared opposition leader Alassane Ouattara as a winner.
Alassane Ouattara got 54.10% of the ballots.
These results were later invalidated by the Constitutional Council, which said Laurent Gbagbo had won the vote. Confusion soon turned violent, and for 5 months the Ivory Coast descended into chaos. 3,000 people were killed in clashes between the two rival camps. That's when critics say Laurent Gbagbo launched a campaign of organised murder, rape and persecution against his opponents, spearheaded by his right-hand man, Charles Blé Goudé. Gbagbo was arrested by Ouattara's troops in April 2011 and turned over to the ICC to face trial for crimes against humanity.
Madame la Présidente, Madame et Monsieur les juges.
After over 2 years on trial, judges in The Hague cleared Gbagbo and his right-hand man, Charles Blé Goudé, of all charges in January. Despite more than 80 witnesses called to court, ICC judges said the case against Gbagbo was exceptionally weak. But for now, the former Ivory Coast strongman remains behind bars as prosecutors appeal the verdict.
In other news, thousands of people have been gathering today in Tehran at the resting place of the Ayatollah Khomeini. These celebrations begin, marking the 40th anniversary of the Islamic Republic. Well, the ceremonies began at 9:33 a.m. That's the exact time that Khomeini's plane landed in Iran back in 1979 as he returned from exile. Well, 10 days after his return, the Shah ordered a flight out of the country, and that marked the end of 2,500 years of monarchy. Back in May, the Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri was handed a third term as Prime Minister and was tasked with forming a government. Well, 8 months later, that new lineup has been unveiled. The post of Foreign Minister will continue to be held by Gibran Bassil, and Ali Hassan Khalil will remain at the helm of the Finance Ministry. But amongst the new ministers are 4 women, including the head of the Interior and Energy Ministries. Well, with the country teetering on the brink of serious financial crisis and with infrastructure crumbling, Prime Minister Hariri called on all political factions to stop squabbling and confront the challenges facing Lebanon. At least 21 people are now known to have lost their lives as a result of the severe weather system which has swept across the US Midwest, bringing with it freezing temperatures and snow. Well, the record-breaking cold snap was the result of a so-called polar vortex, and it brought towns and cities to a standstill, and it resulted in the cancellation of hundreds of flights in and out of Chicago. But according to forecasters, the worst of the freezing weather is over.
A record low in Chicago as temperatures sank to minus 30 degrees. The coldest it has been since the polar vortex struck last Thursday. Authorities in Illinois have announced a state of emergency. Schools, parks and museums have all been ordered to shut. For the homeless in the city, authorities have provided buses to take them to shelters.
As most of you already know, at the mayor's request, we put a CTA bus on the street Sunday night to function as a warming center. By yesterday, that had increased to 5 buses, and over the first 2 nights, we've had more than 160 people take advantage of those 5 buses that are rolling around through Chicago.
With temperatures in some places colder than the Antarctic, the extreme conditions have also disrupted travel. More than 4,000 flights at Chicago's 2 international airports have been cancelled.
My flight was canceled Tuesday night and then again on Wednesday. And so it's Thursday and I'm arriving back home just this morning.
Meteorologists say the deadly cold snap is expected to ease by Friday, but the brutal chill is moving eastward. In New York City, public fountains froze as New Yorkers sought places to stay warm.
Oh, it's crazy. Right now, I was just finding out where any place to hide because it's too cold.
I've been here for all my life, nothing as cold as this. It's freezing, everything's freezing. We went to the fountain down the street. The water that's falling is freezing. Everything's freezing.
Officials warn with such low temperatures, frostbite can occur in as little as 5 minutes.
In the last couple of hours, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced that the United States is going to pull out of a treaty with Russia, which dates back to the Cold War. Well, Washington argues that Moscow has not been complying with the 1987 pact, which bans certain ground-launched cruise missiles. That's something that Moscow denies. Well, Pompeo says the US withdrawal will take effect tomorrow. Here's an excerpt of what he said.
The United States will therefore suspend its obligations under the INF Treaty effective February 2nd. We will provide Russia and the other treaty parties with formal notice that the United States is withdrawing from the INF Treaty, effective in 6 months, pursuant to Article 15 of the treaty. Russia has jeopardized the United States' security interest, and we can no longer be restricted by the treaty while Russia shamelessly violates it.
And that was the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo speaking there. Well, our White House correspondent Philip Crowther is standing by for us. Philip, this isn't a massive surprise, is it? This was a move which was largely expected, I gather.
Yes, it was, and it will become official tomorrow. That's the day that the United States really makes its departure from the INF Treaty official, but it would only be a staggered departure of 6 months. So the United States is giving Russia that possibility, if you will, to be in compliance again in the next 6 months. And that is something that NATO, in its statement just a few minutes ago, has also insisted upon, that there is still a chance to keep this treaty alive, but only if Russia changes its actions over the last few years in the space of the next 6 months. This was something that the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who made the announcement, as you heard, just a short while ago, he had announced this 60 days ago, and he had given Russia, again, that possibility to comply with the INF Treaty. Otherwise, the United States would depart. And that is what it has come to today. It is something that had been announced by the State Department and by the White House, the U.S. President also coming out with his own statement saying that the United States was indeed withdrawing from the treaty. And again, though, giving Russia that possibility to be in compliance again. Now, the INF Treaty is, of course, a cornerstone of peace post-Cold War, and it is an agreement that was signed by President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union then. Now it is a deal between the United States and Russia exclusively. There aren't any other signatories to this treaty. It is supposed to keep the likes of the United States and Russia from possessing any land-based cruise missiles that could strike within 500 to 5,500 kilometers. The United States says that Russia has been doing precisely that it has land-based cruise missiles in place right now, and that is why it has decided to end this treaty altogether.
Yeah, and it raises fears, doesn't it, that, already existing fears, that a sort of a new arms race is underway between these two superpowers. Philip?
Yes, absolutely it does. And actually not only between the United States and Russia, also between the United States and the likes of China, because what the United States here is thinking, well, if Russia isn't in compliance with the INF Treaty, then why should the United States be in a treaty in the first place that doesn't allow it to build these kinds of land-based cruise missiles, doesn't allow it to put them in Europe, for example, and at the same time the likes of China can develop their weapons as they want. That's the kind of arms race that might be developing here, not just between the United States and Russia, also, of course, possibly between the United States and other world powers, and China would be the main one that we're looking at here. There is the very clear possibility of an arms race here, and the U.S. President, Donald Trump, seems to be indicating something like that in his statement that was released a short while ago. The United States, now that it is out of the INF Treaty, or rather when it will be officially out in 6 months' time, will have its own possibility to create those kinds of weapons, to put them in place in the likes of Europe, for example, and that would then lead to the possibility of a serious arms race. This is a decision by the Trump administration that won't be without consequence.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Philip Crowther in Washington. Thanks so much. That brings us up to date with the world news. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.